My husband looked at me across the dinner table one evening and said, "You know what your problem is, Margaret? You've never had to worry about money because I handle everything." I set down my fork. I looked at him, and I smiled. He took that smile as agreement. He was wrong. Let me back up a little because this story doesn't start at that dinner table. It starts 34 years ago in a hospital break room in Columbus, Ohio, where I was eating a cold sandwich on my lunch break, and a man named Gerald walked in, poured himself a cup of terrible coffee, and said, "You're the new ER nurse, right? I've heard good things." I told him he'd heard correctly. He married me 2 years later. For a long time, it was good. I won't pretend otherwise because that would be dishonest, and I've spent enough years around people in crisis to know that dishonesty, even the comfortable kind, has a way of catching up with you. Gerald was funny. Gerald was charming. Gerald could walk into any room and make everyone in it feel like they were the only person he wanted to talk to. I fell in love with that man completely, and I don't regret it. But somewhere around year 8 or 9, something shifted. It happened so gradually, I almost didn't notice. The way fog comes in. You don't see it moving, and then suddenly you can't see your hand in front of your face. Gerald had always managed our finances. In the beginning, that made sense. He had a business degree. I was working 12-hour shifts and coming home too exhausted to think about spreadsheets. He paid the mortgage, the utilities, the insurance. I handed over half my paycheck every month without question, the way you do when you trust someone and you're too tired to ask questions. Then one evening, maybe 2003 or 2004, I mentioned that I'd like to take a weekend trip with my friend Carol. Just 2 nights in a cabin up in Hocking Hills, nothing extravagant. And Gerald looked at me and said, "Do you know how much that's going to cost?" I said I thought we could afford it. He said, "We can afford it because I'm careful." Something about the way he said that. I filed it away and didn't take the trip. Over the years, those little moments accumulated like interest. I stopped suggesting things that cost money. I stopped mentioning that my car needed new tires until the situation was unavoidable. I started keeping a small amount of cash in an envelope in my dresser drawer, not for anything dishonest, just because I needed to feel like there was something that was mine, some small reserve I could access without having to explain myself. I was 61 years old, and I was hiding $40 in my sock drawer like a teenager. I'd been a registered nurse for 36 years. I'd worked nights, holidays, double shifts. I'd held the hands of dying strangers and called their families and driven home in the dark and gotten back up and done it again. I was not a woman without resources. But inside my own house, I had started to feel very small. The real trouble, the kind that couldn't be ignored, started when Gerald retired. He'd worked in commercial insurance for his whole career, and when he retired at 63, he received a pension that was comfortable. Not extravagant, but comfortable. I was still working part-time at a clinic, 3 days a week, because I genuinely loved the work, and also because, if I'm being honest with myself, I wasn't ready to be home all day. When we sat down to talk about retirement finances, Gerald pulled out a folder. An actual folder, organized with tabs. He explained that going forward, he felt we should each contribute equally to household expenses. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, insurance, everything split down the middle. 50-50, I said. "Gerald, your pension is almost double what I bring in part-time." He said, "That's not really the point, Margaret. The point is fairness." I looked at that folder. I looked at his face. He was completely serious. I said, "Okay." He smiled. He thought that was the end of it. I went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened the Notes app on my phone. I started a list. I titled it simply Fairness. Here's what Gerald did not know about me after 34 years of marriage. I am a very organized person. Nurses have to be. You cannot walk into a room with 6 patients and 2 aides and a doctor who changes his mind every 40 minutes without developing systems. I had systems for everything. I had a system for grocery shopping, and a system for tracking my own medical appointments, and a system for remembering which neighbor needed their mail collected when they traveled. I had never applied those systems to my marriage because I had trusted that trust was enough. That changed. I started keeping receipts, every single one. Groceries from Kroger, the plumber who came in October, the electrician in November, the new water heater in January. I photographed them and organized them by category in a folder on my phone. I also started writing down the things Gerald didn't think to count. The hours I spent cleaning the house we both lived in. The meals I cooked 5 nights a week. The times I drove his mother to her doctor's appointments because she didn't drive anymore, and Gerald was always busy. I wasn't angry while I did this. I want to be clear about that. I was methodical. There's a difference. Gerald's daughter from his first marriage, my stepdaughter, Renee, called me in February to tell me that Gerald had mentioned to her that he felt I was finally starting to take household finances seriously. She said it gently, because Renee is a kind person. She was embarrassed to be passing the message along. I told her thank you for letting me know. Gerald's 72nd birthday was in March. About 3 weeks before the date, he mentioned casually that he'd invited some people over to celebrate. I asked how many people. He said, "Oh, just the family, maybe 15, 20. I said, "That sounds nice. What are you thinking for food?" He said, "Well, you'll cook, obviously." I said, "Of course." He looked pleased. He went back to his crossword. What Gerald had not asked and therefore did not know was that I had already spoken with Renee, who had offered to bring a dish. I'd also spoken with my friend Carol, who'd offered to help me in the kitchen, and I had already very quietly made a few decisions about how the evening was going to go. The week of the party, I did the grocery shopping. I bought good ingredients: a standing rib roast, twice-baked potatoes, green bean casserole, 2 pies from a local bakery because I knew my limits and I am not a pie person. I bought flowers for the table. I bought good coffee, the kind Gerald always said was too expensive, and I set it out in the good carafe his mother had given us as a wedding gift. The night before the party, I printed something out and placed it in a manila envelope. The party itself was lovely. Renee came with her husband and the kids. Gerald's brother drove up from Cincinnati with his wife. A few neighbors, a couple of Gerald's old work friends. 19 people in total. I cooked everything and I served it with a smile, and I refilled glasses, and I made sure his mother, who was 89 and hadn't been feeling well, was comfortable in the good armchair near the window. After dinner, when everyone had plates of pie and cups of that expensive coffee, Gerald stood up and made a little speech. He thanked everyone for coming. He talked about how grateful he was for his family. He looked at me and said, "And of course, thank you to Margaret, who kept everything running as always." Everyone clapped. I stood up and said, "I'm so glad you said that, Gerald, because I actually have something I'd like to share." I went to the kitchen and brought out the manila envelope. I set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at me. He laughed a little, the way people laugh when they're not sure what's happening, but they want to seem relaxed about it. I said, "Since we agreed in January that we were doing everything 50-50, I thought it was only fair that I document my contributions accurately." The room had gotten very quiet. Renee's husband put down his fork. I opened the envelope and I pulled out a single printed sheet. I had kept it simple. I'm a nurse. I understand that clarity saves lives. I said, "Groceries for the household from January through March. I paid $412. My share under our agreement, $206. Gerald's outstanding balance, $206. Gerald said, Margaret, I said, utilities. Gerald pays the main bills from the joint account, but I've been paying my cell phone separately and also the streaming services, which we both use. My contribution there, $63. We can call that even. Someone at the table, I think it was Gerald's brother, cleared his throat. I continued. Home maintenance. The plumber in October, which came from my personal account because Gerald said he was short that month, $240. The electrician in November, $10, also from my account. The water heater in January, which we split, so that's accurate. We can leave that one alone. Gerald's face had changed. He was not smiling anymore. I said, now, this is the part I want to make sure is fair. Cooking and household labor. I've been cooking dinner 5 nights a week for 34 years. I've done the laundry, the cleaning, the scheduling. I've driven your mother to 41 medical appointments in the last 2 years alone. I counted because nurses count things. I am not going to put a dollar figure on all of that tonight, because I don't want to ruin your birthday. But I want you to understand that it exists. It has always existed. And it has never, not once, appeared in any of your folders. The room was completely silent. Gerald's mother, from her armchair by the window, said quietly, Gerald. Just his name, nothing else. He looked at his mother. He looked at Renee. Renee was looking at her pie. I put the paper back in the envelope. I sat down. I picked up my coffee. I said, I made the good coffee tonight. I hope everyone enjoys it. Carol, sitting 2 seats down from me, covered her mouth with her napkin. I could tell she was trying very hard not to laugh. I appreciated that. The rest of the evening was subdued. People finished their dessert and said their goodbyes a little earlier than they might have otherwise. Gerald's brother hugged me on the way out and didn't say anything, which was probably the right call. Renee helped me clear the dishes and squeezed my hand at the kitchen sink and said, I've wanted someone to do that for a long time. I told her it wasn't about winning anything. She said, I know, that's why it worked. After everyone left, Gerald and I sat in the living room. He had a glass of bourbon. I had the last of the good coffee. The dishwasher was running and the house was quiet, the way houses get late at night when the people inside them are thinking hard. He said, You've been keeping track. I said, since January. He said, That's not, I didn't mean for it to feel like that. I said, I know you didn't. That's actually the part that took me the longest to understand, Gerald. You didn't mean for it to feel like anything. You just never thought about it at all. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, What do you want, Margaret? I thought about that question. I've been thinking about it in one way or another for a very long time. Not in the dramatic sense. I'm 63 years old. I'm past drama. But in the way you think about a thing when you're driving to work in the dark, or when you're lying awake at 2 in the morning listening to someone else sleep. I said, I want to be counted. He said, I hear you. I said, Gerald, hearing me is the beginning, it's not the end. He nodded. He finished his bourbon. He went to bed. I sat there for another half hour by myself. The dishwasher finished its cycle and clicked off, and the house was very still. I looked around at the living room we had furnished together, the photographs on the wall, the quilt his mother had made us. That was folded over the back of the couch. 34 years of a life in one room. I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew. And this was new. This was something I had not felt in a long time. I knew that whatever came next, I would not be invisible in it. The following Monday, I made an appointment with a financial advisor. Not because I was planning to leave, not because I was planning to stay, because I needed For the first time in 3 decades, to understand exactly what I had and what I was worth and what my options were. A woman who understands her options is a woman who can make a real choice, not just accept the only choice she can see. The financial advisor was a woman named Diane, about my age, with reading glasses on a chain and the calm, efficient manner of someone who had heard everything. I laid it all out for her, the income, the pension, the house, the 34 years. She looked at her notes, and then she looked at me and she said, "You're in a much stronger position than you realize." I told her I was beginning to understand that. Gerald and I are still married. I want to be honest about that, because stories like this one often end with someone walking out the door into a sunset, and that is sometimes the right ending, but it wasn't mine. What changed was not our address. What changed was the terms. We went to a couples counselor. Gerald's idea, which surprised me, and which I will give him full credit for. Her name was Dr. Patton. She had an office on the east side of town, and she had 0 patience for vagueness, which I respected enormously. Gerald learned, slowly and with some difficulty, to say things like, "I didn't consider your contribution," instead of, "I didn't mean it that way." Those sound similar, but they are not the same thing at all. We redid our finances together, with both of us at the table. Not 50-50 based on equal amounts, 50-50 based on proportional contribution, which is actually what fairness means. I have my own accounts now. I know exactly what's in them. I know exactly what I earn and what I own and what I'm owed. His mother called me the week after the birthday party. She's 89 years old, and she's been through things I can barely imagine. She buried a husband, raised 3 boys, mostly alone after the factory closed, kept going when keeping going must have seemed impossible. She called me and she said, "Margaret, I want you to know I see you." I had to sit down when she said that. I'm not ashamed to say it. An 89-year-old woman told me she saw me, and I had to sit down. I told her thank you. She said, "I raised him. Some of this is on me. I should have taught him better." I told her she had done the best she could. She said, "So did you, sweetheart, for a very long time." I've been asked by a few people who know the story, Carol, mostly, and my colleague Janet from the clinic, whether I regret how the birthday party went, whether I wish I had handled it more privately, more quietly, without an audience. Honestly, no. And here's why. I had been quiet for 34 years. I had handled things privately for 34 years. The quiet, private approach had resulted in me keeping emergency cash in my sock drawer and apologizing for wanting new tires on my own car. At some point, quiet stops being gracious and starts being erasure. I didn't embarrass Gerald to hurt him. I didn't stand up at that table out of revenge. I stood up because something in me had finally done the math. Not just the financial math, but the other kind. The kind you do when you're 63 years old and you realize that the years ahead are fewer than the years behind, and you don't want to spend them invisible. If you're reading this and you recognize something in it, if you've ever handed over half your paycheck without question, or stopped suggesting trips you wanted to take, or driven to appointments and cooked dinners and managed the whole invisible infrastructure of a shared life and watched it get filed away under nothing in particular, I want you to know something. It counts. All of it counts. Even if no one has ever printed it out and put it in a manila envelope, you are allowed to be counted. That's the thing I learned at 63 that I wish I had known at 31. Not how to keep better records, not how to make a stronger argument, not even how to stand up in front of people and say my piece without my voice shaking. Just that. You are allowed to be counted. Start the list whenever you're ready. I've thought a lot about what actually happened at that dinner table, not the drama of it, Not the moment I stood up and pulled that envelope out, but the years that made that moment possible. Gerald didn't wake up one day and decide to diminish me. That's the part that took me the longest to sit with. He wasn't cruel in the way that makes a clean story. He was careless. And carelessness, when it goes unchallenged long enough, becomes its own kind of damage. Every time I stayed quiet, every time I put my cash back in the envelope, every time I didn't mention the tires, every time I said that's fine when it wasn't, I was teaching him that the way things were was acceptable. I was, without meaning to, becoming a participant in my own erasure. That's not blame turned inward. That's just honesty. And I think honesty is where real change starts. Not the kind you perform for other people, but the kind you do alone, in a quiet room, when you finally stop explaining yourself and start actually looking. What I know now, at 63, is that intelligence without courage is just a very well-organized hiding place. I had systems for everything. I was sharp. I was capable. I understood people. I'd spent 36 years reading vital signs and making fast decisions in emergency rooms. And I used every bit of that intelligence to manage around a problem instead of addressing it. I got very good at coping. Coping is useful. Coping kept the peace. But coping kept the peace. But coping is not the same as living. And somewhere along the way, I had confused the two. The night of Gerald's birthday, what changed wasn't just the dynamic between us. What changed was something in me, standing up at that table, voice steady, paper in hand. That wasn't revenge. It was the first completely honest thing I had done inside my own marriage in years. And honesty. Real honesty has a way of reorganizing everything around it. It doesn't always make things comfortable, but it makes them real. Gerald had to face something that night, too. When you build your sense of fairness on numbers you've chosen to count and ignore the ones that don't suit you, eventually the full ledger shows up, not as punishment, just as consequence. What we do and what we fail to do adds up quietly, the way it always does. Gerald had been a good man in many ways and a careless one in this particular way, and on his 72nd birthday the carelessness came due. That's not a verdict, that's just how things work. What I hope, if you're hearing this and something in it sounds familiar, is that you don't wait as long as I did. Not because staying quiet makes you weak. I was not a weak woman during those years. I was a woman making the choices available to her at the time. But because you deserve to be counted now, not eventually. Your labor is real. Your presence is real. The invisible work you do to hold a life together is real, even when no one prints it out and puts it in a folder. Start the list. Not out of anger, out of respect for yourself. That's where it begins.